So I'd like to invite our next keynote speaker today, is Mifan Karim. Mifan is our Chief Solutions Officer at WSO2. Mifan leads the solutions architecture team at WSO2 and works very closely with some of our large customers on strategic roadmaps and architecture. So in today's talk, Mifan will talk about the role of enterprise architecture in modernization. So please just join me in welcoming Mifan on stage.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning, Barcelona. Buenos dias. Hopefully, you had a chance to go to the new camp, which is close by, right? I'm a football fan. I'm known as in addition to most of my roles in WSO2, I'm known as the father of football at WSO2. And this is the European version of football, not the US version of football where the ball is, for some reason, oval shape, right? If you are La Liga fans here, Real Madrid and Barcelona are neck on neck now, 60 points each, so it's quite interesting. Today, my talk is about vertical thinking in a horizontal world. Right? You heard the keynotes on the first day, you heard all of the sessions, great sessions from Rania as well on the AI stuff, basically talking about horizontal technology, core technology, right? But I basically want to take you through a real-world architectural concept, right? So this is a video of a world record construction in China. It's an older video, right? It's like 8 years ago or something, and I'm sure the record has been broken now. But this is a building that is 57 stories tall, which was brought up in 19 days, and is an architectural firm in China. Actually, I just got to know Harindu, who is handling all of our logistics in the back, basically knows the owner's son really well. So it's a small world. But if you look at how this construction came about, right, and this is just a time-lapse video, right? Basically, this is mostly steel and glass and a lot of concrete. And to be able to put such a construction together, you basically need like prefabricated concrete that you build in plants in different parts of the world, bring them together, and then start putting them together, right? So basically, composable units, well-known units, best practices, all poured in to basic units that can be put together. And this is a concept that's used quite a bit in physical architecture today. If you look at bridges and constructions, disaster buildings that come up in emergency situations, these are all prefabricated units. And this is big in basically the home building space as well, where you use container homes and go in and build these homes, right? So how do you bring this back into the WSO2 concepts? Yesterday's keynote touched on the need for abstractions, right? The right levels of compositions, basically APIs being a key factor to achieving like a composable business, the right levels of abstractions, being able to hand over the technology parts, the mundane parts, the boring parts or the challenging parts to someone else, and then start focusing on the more important business logic, right? So that's what this diagram spoke about, right? So being able to say, let me shift my focus from focusing a lot on building platforms, and let me shift my focus on building applications, logic that affects customers. But the reality is all of us, every one of us, belongs to some kind of an industry, right? And that's the topic of my talk today. Like, what's the industry thinking? What's the vertical thinking? What's the solution thinking that you bring on top of this horizontal thinking, right? So if you basically look at WSO2's portfolio, you would have seen these numbers, right? So we have around 700 plus customers. Over the last 20 years, we've worked with more than 2,500 plus customers, individual direct customers, right? We have more than 5,000 plus OEM or ISV type deployments. So what does this mean? That means there is one customer who has multiple large scale deployments, right? That's one glass there, right? That's the effect of yesterday, right? It's still hungover. And then we basically have a large number of open source users out there. We don't know what this number is. This is anecdotally, we've said it's like around 25,000 large scale deployments and users out there. But this number can be much higher, it can be lower. We don't know, we don't want to know as well. That's basically the freedom of open source software, right? If you then break this down into the vertical segments, so at WSO2, and this reflects most of the industry standards as well, Most of our customers are, of course, from the banking, financial services, insurance industries, right? So that's like roughly 30% of our customers. We have roughly around 200 plus banks, insurance companies, financial institutions globally, right? And some of the big banks of the world in certain regions as well. Public sector, I'll talk about that in a bit. Healthcare, social assistance, life sciences, it's basically quite large. Again, some really large use cases. So the picture there you can see is nearly all the industries, right? So I've grouped the rest into a category called other, but this is like really all the industries because WSO2 has an orthogonal platform, which is basically used in multiple industries. The text on the other side is more interesting, which is systems of record. So if you look at these industries, there are core banking systems, there are claim management systems, there are education learning systems, there are insurance core systems. So core systems are very critical, right? And we also power a large number of systems of record around the world. So for example, one of the largest medtech companies in the world embeds the WSO2 identity server, and there's easily 1,000 plus deployments there. So anywhere they deploy a CAT scanner, MRT scanner, or any of their devices, there's an identity platform that is used so that the physicians, the lab assistants can log in, right? Any university in the world, basically, there's 80% chance that you're using WSO2, you're touching WSO2 anywhere in the world, right? Because we power one of the largest education management systems in the world. So if you're using an education portal, if you're a student, if you're a staff, if you're faculty, alumni, whatever, you go into the platform, you log in, and there's a good chance you're touching WSO2, right? So the systems of record thinking is also quite important. Government is very interesting. I'm especially proud of our government involvement because, again, this is our open source roots, right? If you look at government, if you look at mission critical deployments, one key factor is transparency, right? If you take countries like Brazil, there is a mandate that you use open source for most of the mission critical industries. And then this is a practice that is followed in many countries. Because think about it, if you're government, do you want to purchase something that's a black box which might go away, which you don't know what's happening in there? You need to know what's happening. So the transparency angle of open source is very critical. These are few numbers. Today we have around 12 to 15 national digital ID projects. There's a bunch of them in Europe. I'll not name them specifically. There are a bunch of them in Middle East, a bunch of them in Asia Pacific, a bunch of them globally, right? And different variations of that. Like if you go into different countries and you walk through border control, there is WSO2 as part of that. And there's quite a few deployments. There are things like vaccine rollouts during the COVID that happened using WSO2. Right? There are citizen portals, there's tax payments, there's property assessments happening through WSO2. So the government space is very interesting. We will talk about this further basically during our sessions today. And there's a lot of case studies out there that you can use. Now, so that brings us to the whole concept of this talk, right? So there is a horizontal set of requirements, a horizontal set of things that you think about, right? So which is, what's my API gateway strategy? How do I do full lifecycle API management? How do I authenticate my users? Is it workforce IAM? Is it external identity access management? How do I do zero trust on my microservices? How do I do what Rania spoke about, which is AI for code and code for AI, right? So it's a horizontal set of things that we need to think about, which is very critical regardless of whatever industry you are in, whatever size of industry, whether you're a startup, whether you're a multi-billion-dollar multinational industry. And then you have a vertical view of the same problem as well, right? So for example, what are my regulations? Do I need to comply with the US healthcare regulations, which is the CMS regulations, which say you need to access, or you need to expose APIs in a FHIR format if you're a healthcare insurance company, right, regardless of your size. Do I need to comply with PSD2 regulations in Germany for banks, for retail banks, right? Do I need to comply with certain healthcare regulations or insurance regulations in certain parts of the world? So regulation is a key driver, key vertical driver that you need to solve. System of record connectors, right? How do I connect to my Temenos and my FIS and my Fiservs in the financial space? How do I connect to guide wires and so on and so forth in the insurance space? How do I connect to the Epics and Cernas and Athenas and the Fire servers in the healthcare space and so on and so forth, right? System of record connectors. Does the platform have industry-specific connectors, or does it have a way of writing connectors or accelerators or a way of calling these APIs, right? Things like interoperability standards, right? If you're in the healthcare space, Fire has now become a global standard, a global interoperability standard. So does the platform support that? Do I need to go write that separately, or can I expect the underlying platform to support that? If I am in the finance space, there is a cross-border communication protocol now called the ISO222 protocol, which is relevant to banks that are doing cross-border. So basically, how do I do that? Do I go and purchase a niche product out there, or do I just use the underlying platform and expect the platform to do this? So that's the vertical thinking, the vertical problem space that we need to think about, even in the horizontal space. Now, what's WSO2's response to this? And this is what we'll be talking about today as well. There are multiple sessions that are focusing on the horizontal stuff. You should definitely go for those, the choreo sessions, the IAM sessions, the API management, integration sessions, etc. There's also an industry vertical track right after lunch. There is a session which is deep diving on the healthcare space, going into a full demo, end-to-end demo in the healthcare space. There is also a session which looks beyond digital banking, and Seshika will be handling that session, right? So WSO2's response is what we've been talking about, right? We build core technology. These are very hard problems, right? So API management, integration. We are leaders or close visionaries in each of these spaces, and if we are not, we aim to be there. And these are critical problems that are applicable to any type of industry, again, regardless of whether you are a startup or whether you are a multi-billion-dollar multinational organization. The extent of how important these are might vary, but these are all critical problems, right? And yesterday, we looked at AI. I would term this horizontal AI, right? Because you are now thinking about, how do I do AI for code? How do I use Copilot within the integration product that we have? How do I use chat to figure out what are the APIs out of the 10,000 APIs that I need to use to build my banking app, right? So these are like horizontal AI capabilities. And we have a bunch of customers that I spoke about as well, right? So we have customers in finance and healthcare and government and retail and so on and so forth. So we have reference architectures for them. We have industry use cases for them. Go to the WSO2 website. There's a bunch of use cases there that you can read through, and these are all public, right? So you can look through them. Now, what we have also done in the platform is we identified a few sets of industries, and these are BFSI, healthcare, and government today. And we looked at the problem space and figured out that there are some interoperability standards. And we are, of course, in the integration interoperability space, right? In the finance space, there is PSD2, there is the BIN, there is the new open banking rules that's coming up in the US, there's the rules that have been in Europe and Asia Pacific and Latin America. So these are all integration problems. At the core of it, this is basically going from one format to another, or basically exposing APIs in a certain format, so on and so forth, right? Similarly, in the healthcare space, you go from like an HL7 version or an X12 version to a Fire version, which is all integration, validation problems, right? So what we said is, let's focus on that as well. Let's basically build some accelerators which can help you rapidly create these services, these APIs, for these specific domains. So if you're using WSO2 already, there are a bunch of accelerators that we've also built that you can then use to build support in these specific spaces. And then finally, vertical AI, and I'll talk about this in a bit as well, right? So you have horizontal AI, but what does a vertical version of AI mean? And I'm going to talk about this in a bit as well. Now, there are vendors out there. Of course, you've seen the standard WSO2 competition, right? So we compete with the API management vendors, with the integration vendors, with the IAM vendors, so on and so forth. Now, with this small angle on the side there, we also start going into the space of niche vendors in specific industries. Because if you look at the problem space, like if you look at healthcare, right, you need to solve the problem of how do I expose APIs in a Fire format, and you have two options. You can either use a core platform like WSO2 or something else, build all of the capabilities, or you can use a niche vendor who is not built on API management, who is not built on integration, who solves a very small problem, right? So that's where we want to play in. We want to say, we are a platform who provides these accelerators as well. You get 80% of the capabilities, 90% of the capabilities from the core platform, and now you have this interoperability support that you can also use to achieve your use cases, right? So let's take an example. So let's take a bank, right? So this is a typical bank technology landscape, right? You have the standard systems. You have systems of record at the southern part of the layer. You have experience APIs, and you have experience systems on the northern part of the layer. You have the typical systems, including the core banking systems, the payment systems, so on and so forth, to the customer relationship management system, so on and so forth. Within this, you basically have multiple use cases, right? How do I expose APIs so that I comply with regulations? How do I expose APIs so that I can start building out newer experiences like my mobile apps and my kiosks? How do I become a digital bank? How do I basically switch my legacy core banking system to a much more modern SaaS core banking system? How do I do basically something like payments automation, right? So let me just keep it here. So for example, I'm going to go into a product level now. So you would have seen if you were at the labs yesterday, you would have seen the integration lab, either the Ballerina integrator or micro integrator. The screen loop here basically is showing you a data mapping example. So interestingly, in the vertical space or any space, more than 50% of development time is mapping data, right? So it's mapping data from custom formats in a core banking system to the standardized format that I need, or basically some standard format from a SaaS core banking system or some customer relationship management system into whatever PSD2 requires, and so on and so forth, right? So we built a very powerful data mapping mechanism where you have a visual way of saying, here's my source system, here's my destination system. I want to basically map between these various systems. Now, one of the advantages in industry verticals is you know the source system or the destination system or both quite often, right? So if you take PSD2, you know what the destination system is. If you take healthcare, you know what HL7V2 looks like. That means you can automate, right? So that's where things like AI comes in as well. That means you can say, here's HL7V2, here's FHIR, do this mapping for me automatically. Save me like 3 months of time by just doing the whole thing automatically, because you know these various systems. So that's the advantage of an industry vertical thinking, right? And this is not just in finance, right? This is in any vertical. Similarly, let's take a healthcare example, right? So healthcare, so this diagram shows the core technologies. Like you can see API management, identity access management, so on and so forth. You have the accelerators, like how do I do validation of FHIR? How do I connect to an Epic or Cerner? How do I basically do patient 360, et cetera, right? And then you have like vertical use cases, right? How do I comply with regulations? How do I, so patient 360 is a vertical use case, right? How do I then connect to my source systems, my destination systems, et cetera? So typical healthcare, regardless of whether you are a provider or hospital, whether you are a healthcare insurance company, whether you are a healthcare software company, whether you are healthcare research and development, life sciences, so on and so forth, a typical architecture. So again, in the healthcare space, what we have identified in the healthcare space is Ballerina has now started becoming a very powerful offering, a niche offering in the space, right? Hopefully you got a chance to go to the Ballerina sessions yesterday. If not, there's a bunch of sessions today and tomorrow. So Ballerina, as we spoke about yesterday, is a language, an integration technology that we built in 2016. We restructured it, re-architected it, and released it again in 2022. We also started porting or adding a lot of these healthcare libraries into Ballerina as native libraries. So I'm going to get geeky a bit here. If you're in the healthcare space, there are 3 ways or 2 ways you write healthcare services. Java, and there's a technology called HAPI, H-A-P-I, and that's the predominant way of writing healthcare services. And then there's a .NET library called Firely as well, right? These are all frameworks that you need to bolt on to Java and .NET, et cetera. So already we know the benefits of Ballerina versus like a Java and something else, or .NET, et cetera, right? And so Ballerina is now the only language in the world which natively understands FHIR, which natively understands HL7. You can just put your whole HL7 message into the language body itself and then start working with it natively. This is similar to how Ballerina works with JSON and XML and streaming data and so on and so forth, right? So it's part and parcel of the language itself. If you need to connect to different systems, if you need connectors, if you need FHIR servers, these are all part of the language, right? I'm not going to go into details. There is a session in the industry vertical which you can go to and talk about it as well. Now, let's come to the AI part. We have to talk about AI, right, in any industry. Verticals are very interesting. If you listen to some of the A16Z podcasts recently and Andreessen Horowitz podcasts, there's a lot of focus on vertical AI, and vertical AI being the next big thing, right? Because yes, there's a lot of use cases in horizontal AI, right? But if you start putting AI into the vertical space, that's really when it starts getting interesting, because that's business value, right? So what we've done here is we've taken the horizontal AI capability that we have, and today we are doing something rudimentary, right? We are doing prompt engineering and basically massaging the prompt, saying, here is all the knowledge that we have about healthcare, for example, right? This is all the HL7 specs, this is the API specs for Fire, this is all the connectors that we have in Ballerina. Take all this knowledge in addition to what Micro Integrator and Ballerina Integrator and all of this knows, and provide me with a better output, right? So that's what we are doing today. The next step is we are converting this to a RAG application. And then following that, we can look at things like, how do you do a fine-tuned model in the healthcare space? How do you do a fine-tuned model in the banking space, which understands open banking and PSD2 and all the regulations, right? So that's the next step. So there's multiple things you can do. And then, of course, the agents, right? Mr. Smith. Right. So basically, once you do that, it really gets interesting. So let me go into this example. And there's a sample prompt that you can see, right? Again, I'll use healthcare as an example because we've done this in healthcare. So let's say I want to write a service that connects to a data source like Epic or something, takes that data source in HL7, converts it to Fire, exposes it as an API, adds OpenID Connect or OAuth2 onto it, adds lifecycle management, pushes it into production, so on and so forth, right? This is a practice, or this is a service that might easily take you 2 to 3 months to develop. And with AI, you can see, you can just write the thing, you can write the prompt. As I said, we are doing prompt engineering as well, so it understands the domain now, and this basically spits it out in a couple of minutes, right? So you can then go from the natural language to the visual diagram. You can tweak the visual diagram. You can go from the visual diagram to the code. You can tweak the code. So it's really a three-pronged view in Visual Studio Code now, where you can see natural language, where you can see your visual elements, and you can see code as well. And that's very powerful for developers who are building out industry vertical use cases, right? So let's put all of these together. And if you remember the video at the beginning, we spoke about prefabricated units, right, in physical architecture. Now, what does that mean when it comes to industry verticals? Because at the end of the day, we are talking about how do you reduce time to market? How do you increase best practices? How do you release more secure code faster, quicker, easier, in a developer-friendly way to the industries, right? How do you get ahead of the curve and be competitive in the space, right? So you have different reference architectures. Like, for example, we looked at banking, we looked at healthcare. Similar case in telco, where you have your OSS, BSS systems, you have your API marketplaces. Similar case in government, where you have interoperable units, you have data custodians. How do you bring these data custodians together? How do you do consent management in that space? And whatever industry you take, whether it's retail, manufacturing, fleet management, so on and so forth, you have these best practices that you can put into reference architectures. I'll take healthcare as an example. Healthcare is near and dear to my heart. I've been working in the space for some time. So let's take an example of a use case where it's a startup, right? And this startup wants to connect to, let's say, 3 different hospitals, right? And then that's a typical use case. And let's say this is an analytics startup. They have a SaaS product, right? So they have consumers at the top of the picture. You have source systems at the bottom of the picture. With the Choreo model today, and Kanchan, I think, spoke about this yesterday, you would go into Choreo and say, I'm going to create a project. I'm going to create an organization. I'm going to create a project. And then now with Ballerina, you have a bunch of accelerators that's out of the box, right? So for example, a bunch of use cases. So what do I want to do here? I want to basically connect to my source system, right? I want to pull an accelerator that can connect to Epic. I want to attach an external API gateway, an internal API gateway to it. I want to basically pull in a validator that validates my FHIR message. I want to basically pull something that can convert from HL7 to FHIR, so on and so forth. So these are all pre-built services because these are all libraries built in Ballerina, right? So you can just basically spin it up, bring it into Choreo, and then you're good. Right? I also want to handle EDI services. In the healthcare insurance space in the US, we have a very archaic system, right? We still deal with EDI files if we don't deal with fax messages, right? So EDI is a big deal in US healthcare. So bring that service in as well. Mostly 80% of the production use cases are handled in Ballerina already because these are all well-known use cases, right? And that basically allows you to provide a full production use case. We worked with a few prospects who came to us saying, this is our problem, and we could actually go into like a production level POC in less than a week because all of these are pre-built services, right? And you can repeat the same model for any industry. So this is just healthcare, this is just an example. But you can look at insurance and repeat the same model as well, quite easily, right? And with Choreo, the beauty is, of course, you can bring your own code in. So you bring your Java code, you bring your .NET code, start using these as APIs, and you're good to go, right? So this is a fully composable unit that you can spin up and run and go all the way to production in the cloud with something like Choreo. If not, you can run it within your environment with Ballerina, right? Now take this a step further. So this is basically a running piece of code on Choreo, right? So you can see the cell-based architecture. You can see different components in there. All of these are pre-built components in Ballerina, and it's just running, right? And some of these can be Java, some of these can be .NET. Okay. Now let's take this a step further, right? So basically I spoke about a use case where you're connecting to 3 different hospitals. So let's say you have your organization. You basically have hospital A. You have a project that connects to hospital A. You clone the project, which has some services. You change the endpoint URL, and you connect to hospital B. And you basically connect to hospital C as well. So you can go into like production level use cases quite quickly using these composable units that are built in Ballerina, that are built that can run in Choreo, so on and so forth. But the concept here is you can basically encompass these best practices quite easily using these accelerators, right? So what this means is now you marry what Asanka will be talking about as well, which is the cell-based architecture with reference architectures, right? If you can see the color difference, the ones in gray here, like a provider API, a patient API, these are pre-built APIs, right? If you have your SaaS platform, you bring your web project, you bring your customer project, you bring this in, and then basically this becomes a reference architecture. So the idea is that we're working on a cell-based vertical reference architecture where you say, this is how a small to medium healthcare enterprise looks like, and this is how you can spin up this enterprise in maybe a week. Or this is how a small digital bank looks like, and this is how you can basically utilize this within a week. So that's something that we are actively working on now, and we'll start releasing this pretty soon, right? So that's basically my talk in a nutshell, right? So this is really about looking at a vertical view of the world, looking at an industry-specific view of the world, because in reality, we live in a vertical world, right? How do you accelerate development? How do you include best practices? How do you basically ensure that you're exposing and building services quickly, securely, easily, and going to market fast, right? And acceleration is an important thing, right? As I mentioned, there is a bunch of sessions that might be interesting. So right after lunch at 1:30, there is a session on healthcare in the industry vertical. At 2 p.m., there is a session on banking. But of course, as I mentioned, this is not just about like the acceleration layer, right? The core layer is the core products that we build. So API management, integration, identity access management, internal developer platform. These are all important building blocks to achieve success in verticals. Thank you very much, and hope to see you soon as well. And we can talk for the rest of the day too.